describe the fracking process and the main environmental concerns that go along with it?
So fracking is this newish technology that came around about 10 years ago, and it was pioneered out west where few people live. And then in 2005, it received exemptions from key provisions of almost all of our federal laws. And that means that we don't have to monitor its air emissions, we don't have to track the toxic waste that it generates, and the fracking industry itself doesn't have to tell us what chemicals it's actually injecting through our aquifers and into the shale. And so it doesn't have to play by the same rules that all other industries do, because at this point we have laws that basically say if you're releasing inherently toxic chemicals into the environment that we all share, you have to measure the amounts and you have to tell us what they are. But that's not true with fracking. And maybe that didn't matter very much for public health when fracking was practiced only in these remote areas in eastern Utah or along the Green River in Wyoming. But as the boom on natural gas extraction via fracking took hold and moved from west to east, now it's moving into very densely populated areas where our rural areas are not just, with 2 or 3 people in them, but thousands of people may be living close to a drill rig. And in fact, the most recent data from the Wall Street Journal is that now 15 million people in the United States live within a mile from a fracking site. And so the idea that this has been rolled out without any advanced demonstration of safety, without any study as to the public health impacts, is really shocking to me. And it's kind of an anomaly at this point. I mean, we do have rules and laws and regulations in place that require some kind of thorough study before something is done. So I just want to emphasize that those exemptions really has made the shale boom possible. So as for what exactly happens, fracking, as I use the word, and as most people now use the word, is a shorthand for an entire process that is the official name for which is high volume, horizontal, slick water, hydraulic fracturing, and then all of the attendant infrastructure that has to accompany that, right? So what is that, right? So it begins with a drill bit that goes from the surface of the earth down into the shale bedrock. And this isn't just any bedrock, but what we're targeting is bedrock that represents the ocean floor of a shallow ocean of some kind that existed right around 400 million years ago. And that's important because these are bedrocks that were laid down during a time in our Earth's history when there wasn't as much oxygen in the atmosphere as there is now, which is why they contain methane. So all of the sea creatures who died and then their bodies sank to the bottom of the sea, because the water at that time was really oxygen poor, they didn't decompose. And so their bodies turned into vaporized corpses, essentially, bubbles of methane, right, which is a single carbon atom with 4 hydrogens around it. And normally methane is bubbly and it's like bubbles in carbonated drink. It would come to the surface, but if silt falls on top of it, it gets trapped. So all these bubbles of these bodies of these animals, mostly things like sea lilies and squid, turned into bubbles of methane, were covered by silt, and eventually that petrified into shale. And so you have a kind of a spill of champagne bubbles, if you will, trapped in a horizontal chalkboard that lies under the ground about a mile or so. So that's what we're after with fracking. So we're actually going to try to get the bubbles outside from the inside of the rock. And to do that, you have to blow the rock apart. So fracking refers to fracturing of the rock. So you send your drill bit straight down, and then what the new technology that has come around recently, which makes this very different from the way they might have done it 60 years ago, is that they figured out how to turn the drill bit sideways and then continue drilling horizontally. So the drill bit goes like a robotic mole right straight through this horizontal shale. Then you send some dynamite down there and blow it all up and start the process of fracturing the rock. And then you follow that with water, huge amounts of water, 4 to 9 million gallons of water per well. And in that water has to be sand. because what you want to do is use the water to blast the cracks that you started creating with the explosives, to blow them further and deeper. But then you have to prop them open, otherwise the gas bubbles won't flow out. So the sand is like the little doorstops that you jam into the cracks, so that when you release the water pressure, you propped open those cracks, and now the gas bubbles can start flowing out. And then it also turns out you need a lot of other chemicals to add to fracking fluid. You need to, first of all, turn all that water-filled sand into jello. Otherwise, the sand is all going to settle out while it goes around the bend. So you have these thickeners that gel it all up. But the gas bubbles can't flow through the jello. And so then, after you get the sand grains in place, then you have to add these what are called breakers to break all these bonds apart and slicken it all up and thin it out again. And then in addition, because the shale is not just a graveyard of prehistoric animals, but it's also actually a living ecosystem, there are organisms that live at those depths. And when you send down jello and water, not surprisingly, they start to grow even faster. This is an ancient domain of life called archaea. And they will clog up the inside of the pipe and interfere with the flow of gas. And so very powerful biocides, things like glutaraldehyde, are also added to fracking fluid to essentially conduct a kind of subterranean pesticide spraying program down there to kill off all these living organisms. And so that goes a long way in explaining why fracking fluid is so toxic. But beyond those basics, we really don't know what any individual company is using. There's a menu of about 500 chemicals that we know that they can choose from to mix their fracking fluid as a kind of cocktail. A sequential cocktail, right? Because you have to add the gel at one time and then thin it out another time, and so you don't just pour it all in there together. But so we don't always know what they're using, which makes it very hard for us in the scientific community who want to ask, well, what are the potential health impacts for the people who live there? What about the workers who are mixing the stuff? And without knowing what the chemicals are, it really impedes the ability of science to go forward. So this allows a kind of cloud of uncertainty to surround the industry, right? It's like a squid who's squirting out ink. It obscures what's really going on so that they have the advantage of saying there's no proof. But we can't get the proof. They've made it impossible to do the science. And there's a number of ways that the industry has impeded scientific knowledge about what they're up to. Keeping their ingredients a secret is one, but also typically fracking takes place on private land, sometimes on public land, which is a whole other issue, right? Because that's land that we own. That's like this land is your land, this land is my land stuff. And the idea that our government is taking land held in trust that we all own and giving it to frackers to use as a staging ground to blow the bedrock apart is one issue. But more typically, fracking is done on our land, which means that those who seek to do it have to obtain a lease to come onto your property and put the drill rig up. And so when they do that, typically in the lease agreement, there are non-disclosure agreements. So that means if your well should go bad and now your water is contaminated, even if you can demonstrate it beyond a shadow of a doubt to the point where you compel the industry to provide you what's called replacement water, these big so-called water buffaloes, which are giant trucks that have big round tanks on the back that come in and provide you your replacement water. Even if that happens, you're not allowed to tell the story of your contaminated well to anybody, not your neighbor, not the newspaper, not anyone. That's part of the contract. And that also means that that person can't call up the Department of Public Health and report that, by the way, we all have nosebleeds and these weird lesions ever since fracking came in, and by the way, our water has been replaced.